Hey everyone, and welcome to your Java tutorial on classes and objects. So let's begin with a quick definition here. We'll start with the definition of a class, and we'll say a class is a code template or blueprint for creating objects. The class of an object determines the type of the object. So it's a code template for creating objects. It is not an object, right? A class is not an object, and a class are two different things. And the class determines the type of the object. So, we've created string variables before. We've created integer variables before. Those, that string object or that string variable is the object or the instantiation of a class, right? So a class defines the functionality that's in a string object. So I keep saying object. You might wonder what our definition for an object is going to be. So an object is a block of memory set aside and configured according to the class blueprint. Right, so an object is just that memory that's set aside and configured according to what the class says. So let's get into this a little bit more, and I can show you sort of the syntax for a class, and then we'll instantiate an object of that type. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go outside of our class scope here, and really you should declare these in other files. But for this example, we're just going to create our class just right down here. We're going to call this class person, and there you have it. This is your basic class. If we wanted to create an object of that class, we would just create a person, and we'll call this Pete. We'll set it equal to a new person. And there you go. This Pete object is an instance of the person class, right? And person has defined the type of Pete. So what I'm going to do is in our person class, I'm going to create a public string variable called first name. And I won't set it to anything. I'll leave it just blank, right? So what I'll do now is I'll create another person, and we're going to call this person Tom. We're going to set it to a new person. And we have the Pete instance of the person class and the Tom instance of the person class. And for Pete, we're going to access first name, and we're going to set it equal to Peter. For Tom, we're going to do the same thing. And we're going to access his first name member variable and set it equal to Thomas. So as you can see, inside of our class, we've created a string variable. And each class instance gets its own copy of that string variable, right? So each class instance gets a copy of whatever functionality is inside of the class, and that functionality is separate. You see, so if we go and we print out, we say first name in the Tom object, and we print out tom.firstname. It should print out Thomas, and then if we do the same thing for the Pete object, we say Pete, then we run this. We see first name of the Pete object is Peter. I didn't put an end line or anything there. And then the first name of the Tom object is Thomas here. We're going to do a print line so that we get our spaces. Just to make this a little bit easier, I'm going to run it again. And we see Peter and Thomas there. And so what that means is that every time you instantiate a class, right? So every time you create an object from a class, that object gets all of its declared methods, and we'll go into methods and stuff in a little bit here, but it gets all of the functionality of that object. So if we were to do something like create a function that returns nothing, a void function called print name, we can do that inside the class. And we can just say system.out.println, and we can say first name here. We can just, when we're inside of the class, when we're inside of the scope of the class, we can just refer to the member variables in this way. You can easily refer to them, even if they're private. So we have public here. We can also make them private. But we have our first name print line here. So now what we can do, is we can do tom.printName, and we can do pete.printName. And so if we run these, we see Peter and Thomas right down here. It's that simple. So you can see how adding that print name as a function inside of our class, and a function that's in a class is called a method. But adding that print name method really cleaned up our code a little bit, right? So it just looks a lot more readable here. So here we have our class declaration, right? And in our class declaration, we define the person type, because when we create a class, we're defining a type, right? If we go back to our definition here, the class of an object determines the type of that object. So when we go to create our variable here, we're using our person type that we've created. We give it the human readable name Pete, and we use the assignment operator to equal a new person class. And this gives us our person object. And then on that object, we can access the variables and the methods that are inside that object. So now the last thing I want to say about classes and objects is that a class is one thing, and from that one thing, you can create many objects, right? So a class, one class can create many objects. That's a one-to-many relationship between classes and objects. But as you can see, creating classes here to represent real-world things or concepts is a very powerful concept, because we can logically group data and functionality that acts on that data, right? They can all get grouped together, and you can call it the same thing. And that's a really powerful concept. And that concept of objects is the backbone of object-oriented programming, which is the most common form of programming right now. So this has been your Java tutorial on classes and objects. Thanks.